So this is the next in my series of videos on modern day monsters that have plagued society. And as I hope people are seeing in these interviews, the real people, the reality behind the scenes is quite different from how they are portrayed in either the media or by certain advocates or others who have some axe to grind, some people who don't like what they have to say. So instead of analyzing their work logically, rationally, based on facts and evidence, they hurl a lot of invectives, they impugn their motives, they hurl just false allegations at them. And I think this was very clear in the case of my guest today, Dr. Alice Dreger, who I'm going to let her introduce herself, and we will talk about probably, I guess, the most famous controversy or infamous controversy that I'm sure you know that I'm talking about. So can you please introduce yourself, Dr. Dreger? First of all, thank you for coming on.
Happy to be here. I'm not actually sure which one you are referring to because I've dealt with so many ugly controversies. So my PhD is in history and philosophy of science from Indiana University, and I worked within academia for a while. I left my position in academia about 2 years ago because of censorship from my dean. So I'm currently working as an academic from outside the system. And my work has generally been on the people who are born with body types that don't fit social norms. So I started off working on people who are intersex, which is people who are born with body types that are not male and not female, but something in between or a blend of characteristics. And then from there, I started looking at what happens in medicine to conjoined twins and to people with cleft lip and people with short stature. And from there, I ended up working on a controversy in transgender over the book by J. Michael Bailey. That got me into the whole, for about the last 10 years, I've been working on scientific controversies in terms of what happens to academics when they put forth an idea that is politically unpalatable to some groups.
Right, and that you've captured, I guess, most recently in your book, Galileo's Middle Finger.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, Galileo's Middle Finger is, it's kind of a working memoir. So it's a memoir about what I started doing in terms of intersex work, and I was sort of on the other side of things. So I was one of the activists criticizing various academics, in this case, people in academic medicine, about what they were doing with intersex children. And then the Bailey book controversy was something that I got into because of interactions with some of the people that had gone after him. And I ended up spending a year on that controversy and seeing what had happened to him at the hands of activists who fought dirty. And then from there, I went on to interviewing other academics around the country who had been through similar things. So the book is largely about sort of exploring those different things and getting involved in different controversies. And then at the end, I come back to the intersex rights work because I came upon a problem where one researcher was abusing a particular intersex population in terms of research and medical care. And so I sort of come back and try to make the point that we need activists to balance out the excesses that occur within research. So there are times where we really need activists, but obviously activism, as with academia, should be based on facts, not on made-up ideas.
Right. Okay, and before we do talk about the I know that was the controversy I was talking about, the J. Michael Bailey controversy over his book, The Man Who Would Be Queen, and I had Dr. Bailey on a few weeks ago. I've been posting some snippets of his videos, of his interviews with me. Just before we go further, because you were talking about intersex individuals, and a lot of people would know them as hermaphrodites. Just what is the history on why the change from hermaphrodites to intersex?
Sure. So the term hermaphrodite actually came out of popular culture, and it was true in 19th century medicine, so in the 1800s, that many of the terms used in medicine just used the street terms for things. So when medicine began to, in earnest, explore various kinds of sex anomalies, they used the term that was available in the culture, which was the term hermaphroditism. And they made it, sound very official, and they used different types of hermaphroditism to talk about. So in the late 1800s, they started talking about pseudo-hermaphroditism and true hermaphroditism as medical terms. But the term never really lost its sort of pop culture stigma. So in the early 1990s, when people who had been born with these conditions started in earnest to form a rights movement, they started using the term intersex for themselves, which had been in medicine to some degree, but most of medicine was still using the stigmatizing terms hermaphroditism and pseudo-hermaphroditism. And the problem with those terms is they implied a sort of fantasy people had that you had the organs of both sexes completely, which is not the case. It's not biologically possible. So it was not a very useful term. The other problem was because it was stigmatizing, a lot of doctors were not openly telling people about it. So when the intersex rights movement started, people decided to use the term intersex because they felt it was a more modern term, and because they felt like it was a term that would get us sort of past the 19th century conception of approaching this and try to bring it into the modern era.
Right.
So the first person who actually started doing intersex rights work was Dreger in the 1980s. So the rights movement is actually 30 years old now. But the group that sprung up in the early 1990s, that was the most powerful group for a while, was the Intersex Society of North America, or ISNA. And I was a member of that group and one of the leaders in it for a few years.
Okay. And so, there's so much political correctness these days, and people are afraid to say anything at risk of offending others. But then sometimes language needs to be changed for the reasons that you mentioned. So from how you're describing it, sounds like you would say that this was a good change of language, to not offend others with, let's say, either inappropriate usage or I'm not sure if the right word would be potentially stigmatizing language. Would you agree with that in this case?
Well, I thought so at the time, but it didn't really work very effectively. And part of the reason it didn't work within medicine, I will say in pop culture, it worked because it got people's attention. It got them to understand that what we were talking about was not some mythological fantasy, but something that really happens in people and in other animals. So in that sense, it helped in the pop culture realm, but it didn't help in the medical realm because the doctors didn't like the term. It used the term sex, which made them nervous when talking about babies and little kids. It also became a politicized term, so the doctors didn't want to use it because it was a term that got wrapped up with the LGBT movement, and doctors or pediatricians didn't want to politicize babies, understandably. So it didn't. What ended up happening is we had, on the one side, the folks in pop culture and activism using the term intersex, and then the doctors continuing to use the term hermaphroditism and pseudohermaphroditism into the 2000s. So in 2006, I was the lead author of a paper that argued it was time to change the language in medicine, and that we ended up recommending that we use the term disorders of sex development, or DSD, to say that there's a child born with a DSD. That was something that doctors were very happy to do because they said, yes, finally you're admitting this is a medical issue, which we had been saying it can be a medical issue. So, but that then became very controversial because a lot of activists didn't like the idea that we were calling this a disorder. So then that created a whole new blow up. And nowadays we tend within the medical realm to talk about differences of sex development. So we still use the term DSD, but we use differences, which is working pretty well right now. But there are still some activists who don't like the term because they prefer to see intersex as an identity. I think intersex is an identity if you choose it as such, but that for people born with it as babies, and as young children, that's not an identity issue. It's a biological issue. So we talk about a child born with DSD. And if that child later wants to identify as an intersex person, I have no problem with that.
Right. And, I'm not as familiar. I teach about intersex individuals or people with DSD.
Great.
Okay, so... But I'm not as familiar with that as I am with other topics. So I'm curious, are then the activists who've tried to make, any type of condition, they've tried to glorify, they tried to say, this is not something that we should try to fix or cure or remedy. It's something that we should embrace, and it's actually a good thing. Some of the most, unfortunately, handicapping, limiting medical conditions, people are still saying, no, embrace it. Is there a large movement where they're saying, no, we shouldn't try to operate, we shouldn't change, we should, at any time in their life, we should just, embrace them having these, different sets of genitals?
The great majority of activists that I know have the same opinion that I do, which is you need to sort out the medical and the social. So you need to figure out, does this baby or young child actually need a medical intervention because their life is in danger, or because they're going to lose fertility, for example. So there are some medical conditions associated with intersex that can be very dangerous. They're more unusual than most of them. Most of them are just you look different. But some of them actually have medical implications. Like there's one hormonal imbalance called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which can actually, in severe forms, can kill you if you don't have it medically treated. So that, we all agree, needs to be medically treated as a hormone issue. There's also some types of formation of the gonads, so the ovaries or the testes, where they form as what's called ovotestes or dysplastic gonads, and that can sometimes lead to cancer. And so we obviously want to make sure a child doesn't get cancer and die of cancer. So there are some types that require surveillance or medical intervention to save health or to save life. And in those cases, pretty much, I don't know any activist who feels differently, that says, yes, in those cases, you do interventions. But most of them have the same feeling that I do, which is if we're talking about changing the genitals because they look different, that should be something left to the child to decide, that a child should grow up and decide, what do I want to do with my body? In the same way that in most other things, we honor the child's autonomy and their ability to decide. And in this case, it's sexual autonomy, which strikes me as very important to one's life. So we should provide support, psychological support, social support. We should provide medical support as needed. Help the parents. Some of them have distress. Some of them have anxiety, depression. We should help with all of those things, but empower the child to understand their own body, raise them as a boy or girl based on best guess, which is what we do with everybody. We best guess. And then let them decide later if they want to make changes to their body and take the risk, because the surgeries are actually quite risky.
Right. And so in that movement, are there parents or activists, are there activists who are really pushing? Because I spoke to a mother of a child who declared she was transgender at 13, never showed any signs before. She had autism. I haven't put that clip up yet, but she has autism, and the therapist that they went to see, instead of saying, let's examine why she might feel this way, so, just pushed straight into binding, into the hormone therapy, very quickly. So I'm wondering, are there activists who say, if a child is born a certain way with these different, sets of genitals, that we should push them one way or the other? Or are most activists, are they saying, let them sit back, let them decide, don't politicize it? What have you seen?
This is a source of tension, actually, between the intersex rights activists and the transgender rights activists. And it's because intersex rights activists take very seriously the idea that these surgeries and the hormone treatments and things like binding are significant medical interventions, that they feel it's very important to make sure a person choosing to do those things is fully informed and capable of making the decisions. So I think we all feel very strongly that if a child needs a social intervention to identify as a gender different from the one they were assigned at birth, then there are ways to do that help support the child and reduce odds of suicidality and help with depression, et cetera, et cetera. But that doing medical interventions is something to be taken with great caution. And a lot of people don't know, the same teams that do the intersex interventions in pediatrics are the teams that do the transgender interventions. And some people look at it and they look at the transgender side and they say, why are they so progressive over there, but they're so regressive when it comes to intersex? But in fact, the teens tend to be anxious in all cases to get kids sorted out, right? To make sure they're either clearly male or clearly female and get it all sorted out. And our inclination on the intersex rights side is to say, be supportive, but be open to the possibility that we don't know where this is going, right? So try to keep the open future possibility in terms of understanding they may choose differently later. If you have a kind of situation where you change your genitals or you take out your gonads, you can't get them back. That is just how it is. It is not a reversible surgery. You can get another surgery, if it's your genitals, to try to create a new set of genitals again, but you never get back the lost tissue. So we are very clear that there are ways to do social intervention support that doesn't require medical interventions, and that medical interventions are very serious and should be taken with great caution.
Right.